voices in the Kremlin and voices directly connected to the Kremlin expressing doubt at Zelensky's interest in true peace negotiations. The Russians, of course, love to question the Ukrainians and their own interests. But so we're seeing a lot of that in Russian state media, really amplifying it to the Russian public. And of course, this morning and late yesterday, we saw Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov even really kind of drawing out discussions of this and trying to build up some kind of allure around this, but it seems very unlikely that Putin will show up.
So all eyes are on Istanbul tomorrow. But as I was alluding to earlier, will there be anything to watch? Who will actually show up for the talks? Angelica Evans is a Russia analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank in Washington, and she joins us now. Welcome, Angelica.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
Nice to have you. Now, I was reading the latest Russian offensive campaign assessment by the Institute for the Study of War last night, and there seems to be little doubt in your minds that President Putin has no intention of agreeing to President Zelensky's invitation to meet in Istanbul tomorrow for ceasefire negotiations. What are you picking up?
Yes, we're seeing a lot of discussions from now, voices in the Kremlin and voices directly connected to the Kremlin expressing doubt at Zelensky's interest in true peace negotiations. The Russians, of course, love to question the Ukrainians and their own interests. But so we're seeing a lot of that in Russian state media, really amplifying it to the Russian public. And of course, this morning and late yesterday, we saw Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov even really kind of drawing out discussions of this and trying to build up some kind of allure around this, but it seems very unlikely that Putin will show up.
Yeah. On the one hand, President Trump casts himself as a deal maker, of course, and one who said he could bring the war in Ukraine to a close. And many of us have been alarmed to see him, however, at the White House in February, seeming to bully, in the eyes of many, President Zelensky into accepting the loss of sovereign territory. On the other hand, to give him his dues, he's unpredictable, and that must also be in President Putin's mind. Do you think the Trump presidency will at some point help to expedite a ceasefire, or will the manner of his approach actually do the opposite and perhaps even lead to a protraction of the conflict?
I think we're continuing to see really interesting signals from the Trump administration. Of course, the February meeting was really unfortunate and was a huge shakeup in the U.S.-Ukrainian diplomatic relationship. But President Trump has kind of seemed to turn a little bit more positively towards Ukraine, particularly since they've signed the mineral deal. And I do think possibly the only thing that could get Putin to Istanbul is if President Trump showed up himself. You know, they're both leaders who believe deeply in personal relationships and who kind of use that to their advantage in some ways. And to their detriment in others. And so, I think he's a wild card in this mix that both leaders are still learning how to respond to.
Yeah. Do you think there's still a chance of that, of President Trump pitching up in Istanbul?
I really don't know. I think it seems like he's going to be sending some other representatives there, so it's seeming increasingly unlikely. But, there was a moment when he was discussing that maybe it could happen, and then things kind of turn on a dime in this administration. So I would say it's not zero chance that he might show up.
Okay, well, that's something. What's your analysis of the combat itself telling you? Is Russia, repeatedly committing more and more troops to the front line?
Yes, we are continuing to see Ukrainian reporting of Russians deploying more and more troops to replace the losses that they're taking in Ukraine. We've been tracking over the last few months an intensification of battlefield activity all along the front line, particularly in Donetsk, which is a priority area for the Russians, as a lot of people know and see, particularly in our reporting. And this intensification and this continued willingness to commit more troops to the front line really suggests that the Russians are not thinking about the immediate possibility of peace. And even the rhetoric that we continue to see out of the Kremlin suggests that they remain committed to their goals of taking all of Ukraine, be it militarily or diplomatically, if they believe that they can, achieve that in negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, it's already a bloody, drawn-out conflict. Do you sense that Putin has convinced the Russian public of the need for a long-term war in order to achieve his aims?
I think even some of the recent polling that we've seen about how Russians are feeling about negotiations or the possibility of a ceasefire suggests that they've done a really good job at convincing the Russian public of the need for this war, and even really starting to lay the groundwork for, a future war with a NATO member state even. That's something that we're really starting to track and see
Really?
come alive in the Russian public.
And the
There's
Russian
been
public,
kind of a
sorry to
lot.
interrupt, that the Russian public will be aware there of the Article 5 treaty within NATO's agreement.
Yeah, I think this is where it becomes really interesting to think about how the Kremlin has been messaging throughout the entire war, right? That it's not fighting Ukraine, that it's fighting NATO. And so I think there's a question of if the Russian public already believes that it's, engaged in a war with NATO. And there are a host of lines of effort that the Kremlin has been setting up, particularly over the last 3 years, to kind of convince the public that this is necessary and that, the West and Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia.
You write that any long-term peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine must include Russia's explicit recognition of the legitimacy of the Ukrainian president and the government and the Ukrainian constitution. And we at the Times agree with you, of course. Will that ever happen under Vladimir Putin?
It's a great question. As we're discussing, all of these narrative efforts, right, are quite hard to undo on Putin's end. He's spent the better part of the last year or the last decade really questioning the legitimacy of all Ukrainian governments since Euromaidan. And so now we're kind of seeing him use this question of legitimacy to kind of set conditions to violate any peace agreement that they might come to under the guise that it's not real, that the Ukrainian government, doesn't have the right to sign these agreements. And so it would be a very hard U-turn for Putin to come away from this, and it might be something that's hard to sell, given how long he's committed to this narrative.
Finally, Angelica, just coming back to tomorrow, if these ceasefire talks don't come about, how should the West respond? And I mean by that both Europe and the United States, in the full knowledge that they, of course, may not act in unison.
Yes, I think, we're continuing to see the Europeans really come to a stronger place of unity than we have seen. And so I'm really hopeful for that. I think, of course, we need to realize that for a conflict to end, both sides have to be interested in it. Ukraine has continued to demonstrate its interest, but the Russians are just playing pretend in all of this. And so when we realize that, and when we come to that decision point, I think it's important for the West to continue to arm Ukraine and to provide the Ukrainians with the ability to fight back, and to continue to defend themselves against Russian aggression.
Yeah, well, hear, I say to that. Angelica, it's been great to have you. Thanks so much. That's Angelica Evans from the Institute for the Study of War in Washington.